Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. It is 3:05, and I'm live from area code 202. Thanks for joining our third Cuba Hangout. On the first Friday of every first Friday through April, we will be exploring relevant and popular Cuba-related topics through conversations with a variety of fantastic speakers and members of our community. Our goal is to add meaningful content to a complicated and often misrepresented topic, Cuba and U.S.-Cuba relations. This is an ongoing series brought to you by Cuba One and Cuba Educational Travel. Cuba One Foundation offers a new generation of Cuban Americans the opportunity to give back to Cuba, build relationships with the Cuban people, and explore its heritage through high-impact trips to the island. And Cuba Educational Travel is the leading organization in connecting the people of the U.S. and Cuba through travel. CET, as they're known, offers cultural, educational, and luxury travel to Cuba, working with clients to develop unique, customized, and curated experiences on the island. I'm Emily Mandrela, and I'm the Executive Director of Center for Democracy in the Americas. CDA is a nonpartisan, Washington-based institution, nonprofit, that promotes a U.S. policy toward Cuba based on engagement. And finally, today's guest speaker is Ambassador Vicki Huddleston. We are very fortunate to have Ambassador Huddleston with us this afternoon. Ambassador Huddleston grew up in Hungry Horse, Montana. I love that. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in Peru, graduated from the University of Colorado and Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. She's a fellow at Harvard's Institute for Politics. She was the U.S. ambassador to Madagascar and to Mali, an acting ambassador to Ethiopia, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Africa, and a USAID contractor in Haiti. She was the first woman to head our diplomatic mission in Havana, and her book, Our Woman in Havana, A Diplomat's Chronicle of America's Long Struggle with Castro's Cuba, illustrates
Emily, I can't hear you. I think I've been muted before I've gotten started, so I can't hear anything.
Oh,
there you are. Good.
Did you miss my whole introduction?
No, I got the first part, but when you were getting into more
How wonderful you are.
Off, so that
well, we have Ambassador Huddleston with us. She's wonderful. Her career is storied at the State Department, Department of Defense, and she was a USAID contractor in Haiti. First woman to head our mission in Havana. Her book, phenomenal, Our Woman in Havana, A Diplomat's Chronicle of America's Long Struggle with Castro's Cuba, has some super interesting stories and tells about Ambassador Huddleston's time in Cuba, as well as the long history of U.S.-Cuba relations. I'll turn it over to you for some remarks.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Emily, and thank you all for inviting me to be on your program, Center for Democracy in America. You've done so much, and it's so great. Hangouts, sponsored by Cuba One and Cuba Travel are doing this because really engagement's so important. But look, it's been 60 years, and we're still doing the same old isolationist policy toward Cuba. So perhaps today we can talk about what we might do and how we might change this policy and have a better relationship with Cuba.
Well, great. Then I will reserve the right to ask the first few questions, and then we'll turn it over to the group. First, I'll start with you. You are a super impressive leader. You have an incredible career trajectory. And I know there are a number of women specifically watching this broadcast today. And I want to know if you can share with us your experience as a woman leader in U.S. national security, and additionally as a woman serving in Havana. Can you share with us your experience?
I can, but I'd like to say first, I'm so delighted to see all these women here today because I really think women can make a huge difference. And I think that Cuban American women in particular, like the group that's going down to Cuba, should take a lead in this. I mean, maybe they should organize marches, protest the policy. But women understand how much the embargo and the US policy hurts Cuba and hurts Cuban families. So I just would love to see Cuban American women taking really high profile leadership, because let's face it, Cuban Americans, and now they're Cuban conservative Cuban Americans, they're the people who control the policy. So let's create a new dynamic and a new leadership, which would be Cuban American women who understand we need to change this policy. Okay, so much for my editorial comments. But you ask about me and my leadership role. Well, it's really great to see that there's so many more women now in national security positions. There's so many. I mean, you have Susan Rice, you have Wendy Sherman, and you had Wendy Chamberlain. So I'm of course thinking about the Clinton and Obama administrations. There are less in the Trump administration, but still a few. I thought that perhaps to move to Cuba, I had more influence because I was a woman. First of all, Fidel Castro, liked to deal with women, probably because he was a big, handsome guy and he figured he could influence women more. You know, you remember his famous interviews with Barbara Walters. Well, he really liked that kind of thing. And so when I came to Cuba, he was very interested in, if not engaging me personally, engaging me through sort of a airsats competition, because I would always be coming up with these ways to challenge his government. And we'll talk about that a little more. And then he would respond. And his responses were quite interesting in a number of cases. So I like to think that we were in sort of a competition for the hearts and minds of the Cuban people. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I thought that because I was able to engage, because I was able to put my ego aside and was more willing to try innovative ideas, such as handing out radios, little AM, FM radios in Havana and throughout Cuba, that I had more of an impact. And I think that's often true with women, and certainly with this group of women who are going down to Havana. You're, you're more willing to look at, well, what's really going on here? Why hasn't U.S. policy worked for the last 60 years? So that's what women bring, I think, to foreign policy: a new perspective, a willingness to be flexible and innovative.
I love that, and I love the idea of us joining forces to march on Washington to change the policy. Let's put that in the cards for
Yeah,
2019. I'm going to change directions and ask you to tell us a story, if you will. Can you tell us about your dog named Havana? And I understand there's quite a story associated with the Cuban Afghan Hound Association. And I'll ask a preemptive follow-up with a bit of a spoiler. I apologize. It's a silly story with a humorous diplomatic response. And I wonder if you, in sharing the story, can tell us if there are any lessons that can be derived from the story, anything that we can learn about effective tools of diplomacy.
I think so. I think even from a dog story, there some effective diplomacy can be teased out. But I did it on purpose. But let me go back and tell you about Havana. Havana was a Cuban dog, an Afghan hound. There are Afghan hounds in Cuba because in the 50s they were popular. You know, that was the age of Rita Hayward and the Aga Khan, who used to go down to Cuba, Cienfuegos in particular, hang out, gamble in the casinos, get suntanned on the beach, all before the revolution. And ironically, Afghans are still around, and so are dog shows. Even though some people say, how can Cuba have these capitalistic dog shows? But really, it it's amazing how dedicated the Cubans are to their dogs. Cubans would come up with their Afghans from Camagüey in the back of a truck. And of course, they would get rained on, and if it was raining, it was dirty and slow and tiresome, but they really wanted to show their dogs. In any case, I had an Afghan hound, and I got a trainer, an African Cuban, brilliant, and a dog whisperer. And she began to show my lovely Afghan hound, who began to win all the ribbons. And so pretty soon I got a letter from the president of the Afghan hound, Amalia Castro. No relation, maybe, I don't know. And it said that I was being dishonorably discharged from the Afghan Hound Association because of my government policies and my actions on behalf of dissidents in Cuba. So I couldn't resist. I went to the Washington Post, to NPR, to Univision, to ABC, and I made a really big deal out of being in the doghouse and how this gave diplomacy a pause. And we just did all this kind of silliness. But at the same time, I could take my dog and show the dog and then talk about how the U.S. interest, the U.S. residence where I lived is completely isolated, and how the Cuban government tries so hard to control all its people and even diplomats, including Americans. So I was delighted because I thought I could show the control the Cuban government exercises over its people. Well, Fidel was furious because it was making all the news media, the international news media, every little paper in the United States, people were asking all the time. So Castro then announced that he was giving my husband's dog a pardon. Because he didn't want to, admit I had won this round, which in fact I had. So a lot of people just thought, oh, it's silly. What are you doing? And some lady, one Cuban woman who was a friend said, oh, Vicki, I'm so sorry about all this. And I was like, no, this is wonderful. We got a lot of attention. We showed that we could stand up to the Cuban government, and the Cuban government had to back down, and we refused. And we refused to back down, and we did show, I think, the Cuban people that you can stand up to the Cuban government.
It also seems that a little humor went a long way in instead of being deeply offended that Havana was banned from the Havana Dog Show, that a little bit of, tongue-in-cheek dog puns. I think one excerpt from your book said the State Department spokesperson, when asked for a comment, responded, woof, woof. It seems as though there are serious matters of diplomacy, and then there are those that are best dealt with by humor, and I applaud you for the latter in this context. And I guess that leads me to the next question, which is a bit more serious and less humorous, is the current state of U.S.-Cuba relations. And we find ourselves in a difficult moment. President Trump and his top advisors have ratcheted up negative rhetoric toward Cuba, hostile rhetoric, and some of that rhetoric has been followed on by actions, additional sanctions, curbing of some trade and travel to Cuba. And I wonder if you were given an opportunity to brief the president right now, what would you say to him? What advice would you give him on U.S. policy toward Cuba?
Well, first, I can't resist but to carry on the dog metaphor with, it seems to me that this policy is worse than being in the doghouse. It's sort of like stepping in something that you have to scrape off your shoe. So I am not a fan of this policy, but here's what I would tell President Trump. President Trump, obviously, you believe Cuba is not democratic, it's authoritarian, it's sort of a communist regime. It has jailed some human rights activists. It doesn't tolerate opposition. I get it. But look, for 60 years, other than the period of Obama and his last 2 years, two years of his last term, we've had a policy of isolation and embargo toward Cuba. It hasn't worked. It's failed. Whether you like the Cuban government or hate the Cuban government, this policy is an utter failure. So, what should you do to change things? Well, I believe in order to change things, you have to engage. And I can point to when things were better between Cuba and the US, but also better for the people in Cuba. And that's when things were more open. Uh, One example is during Bush, George W. When I was still there in his first 2 years, he continued the Clinton people to people. Things were much better. We were doing agricultural sales. Cuba helped us on securing Guantanamo when we put the illegal combatants there. And the human rights in Cuba were really very much better than usual. It was called the Cuban Spring. When Bush changed the policy at the behest of conservative Cuban Americans, Castro jailed 75 dissidents, and in 2003 it was the Black Spring. So a complete reversal when the U.S. and George Bush reversed their position. And in many ways, the same thing with Obama. Under Obama, the Cuban government was allowing more entrepreneurship, more travel, and now the entrepreneurship, the private businesses are being pushed back, licenses are being taken away, and things are getting harder for people who want to have independent businesses. So I would end by saying, Mr. President, I know you're doing this at the behest of the Cuban American community, the conservative Cuban American community led by Senator Marco Rubio, and very much supported by your national security advisor, John Bolton. But let that go and do what's best for the United States and for the region. And the best way, I think, to do that is not only end the embargo, but begin a dynamic program for the Caribbean that will diminish illegal immigration, of which you're very concerned with, and will help the region and its people gain prosperity and not want to immigrate to the United States. We really need a comprehensive policy that includes Cuba and in which we treat Cuba like any other country in the world.
What about for us? There are a number of us watching today that are interested in promoting engagement between the U.S. and Cuba in one form or another. And we, you have considerable experience working to do just that in government, outside of government, with different challenges. Your time in Cuba spanned two very different administrations, U.S. administrations, with different challenges and different approaches. Your book details some missed opportunities for détente. What advice can you give to us? What do you see as the best, most effective ways to promote engagement between the U.S. and Cuba? And how can we, who are collectively working, avoid missing future opportunities that should arise?
Well, I just so much admire you. I mean, the Center for Democracy in America has worked so long and so hard to promote a different policy toward Cuba, one of engagement. And now, of course, you have Hangouts, you have Cuba One, you have educational travel, and you have a number of other organizations that are trying to promote engagement with Cuba. But it's such a difficult time because you have an administration that's catering to conservative Republicans in Florida, principally Cuban Americans, and this administration is not going to change, alas. And so you just have to keep plodding on and doing what you're doing, such as bringing down these wonderful 10 women that we're going to talk with soon to see Cuba and to understand, okay, this is not a perfect country. It has many faults. The government, its way of governing, there are freedoms are limited, both on the economic and political side. But U.S. policy only gives the Cuban government an excuse to be repressive and to have a scapegoat for what it's doing. So keep up what you're doing. When we get a new president in 2020, hopefully he or she will change Cuba policy. We'll go back to the Obama opening, and then we'll see some real change, not only in Cuba, but in the situation of the Cuban people, which really bothers me more than anything, and also see a strong renewal of ties between Cuba and the United States. We shouldn't be enemies, a country only 90 miles away.
Well, we'll turn it over to questions now. And as you mentioned, Cuba One and Cuba Educational Travel are leading a group of phenomenal women on a women's delegation called Unidas to Cuba later this month in just a couple of weeks. And I'm pleased that CDA will be there at the same time with a group of women leaders in national security, and we'll have a chance to meet each other while we're there in Havana. But I'll turn it over to Cherie for the first question, and then we'll have some other delegates from the trip to pop in with questions as well.
Emily, it's been fun talking with you.
Likewise, Ambassador Huddleston. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily and Ambassador Huddleston. This has been an incredible experience hearing you. As part of Cuba One and founding Cuba one of the most incredible experiences that I love to watch when I'm excited to watch this with our new group is their first experience and interaction with Cuba and Cubans on the island. Many of the people on this upcoming group have never been to Cuba at all. A lot of their experience with Cuba through the black and white photos of our parents and grandparents and through culture that we have here in the diaspora. So my question is, what was your first experience and interaction? What were feelings that you had your first time going to Cuba?
Can you repeat the question, because it's kind of breaking up?
Yes, my question is, what was your initial reaction or experience that when you first went to Cuba?
What was my experience when I first went?
Your first time in Cuba.
Well, let's see. The first time in Cuba, I was the deputy director of Cuban Affairs, and I just came down, to get acquainted with the country, and it was very interesting because the Cuban officials were very nice to me. Obviously, they were trying to court me, especially since I said I would go to the Bay of Pigs, and I went to the Bay of Pigs, and I saw the museum, and I looked at all this, and I saw this big sign, and it said, the first victory, the first defeat of North America in the Western Hemisphere, the Bay of Pigs. I thought, actually, that's true. And then subsequently, I went often. And then I went when I became director of Cuban Affairs. And at that time, I met Fidel Castro. And it was at a big soiree, which was celebrating the return of 50,000, I would say 50,000 Cuban troops from Angola. Cuba is the only foreign country that wins wars in Africa, but they help both Ethiopia and Angola. In this case, with Angola and Cuba's military help, they forced South Africa out of Namibia and began this unraveling of the apartheid regime in South Africa. In any case, when I met Castro, he embarrassed me because he said, "Well, who are you? Someone's spouse?" I thought maybe the women of the group might appreciate that. And I said, "No, I'm the director of Cuban Affairs." And Castro kind of gave me this coy little smile and waited till everyone in this room of about 200 diplomats were listening and said, "I thought I was director of Cuban Affairs." So I was pretty embarrassed, but it led to a conversation with him subsequently. in which it was clear he was looking for some kind of opening and hoping that the U.S. wouldn't further tighten the embargo, which the Cuban American National Foundation and conservative Cubans were calling for. And when I went back to Washington, I talked with my boss and superiors at the State Department about this. But ironically, H.W. Bush didn't want to increase sanctions because, after all, Cuba had complied with removing its troops from Angola. But a candidate named Bill Clinton needed money and support, so he said, let's bring down the hammer on Fidel Castro. And as a result, H.W. Bush immediately said he would sign on to the Cuba Democracy Act, which increased the embargo and made it extremely difficult for Cuba to buy medicine and food for the Cuban people. And during this period, which became known as the special period in time of peace, Cubans really suffered. And part of that suffering was a result of the United States tightening the embargo.
Another question from the group. Feel free to unmute yourself and then jump in.
I have a question. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you, Cuba One, and everyone for putting this together. It's been really great. I have a quick question about how to interact and start a conversation with maybe someone that isn't involved in diplomacy and isn't involved directly with these conversations with the embargo. But how would you suggest, or how would you personally go about having a conversation with a close relation that is wrapped up in the narrative that seems to me quite political and politically driven, as far as more conservative leaning point of view of the American policy? I'm thinking more specifically through the lens of the American policy, not through the lens of the Cuban policy, because that's where I grew up, and the world that I grew up in that has that lens, which is clearly American conservative policy driven. How do you have a conversation with how do you suggest having a conversation with a close relation that is wrapped up with that narrative and that sort of political agenda?
Yes, I'm sure that's a personal question.
Definitely.
And I've had a number of those conversations, none of which have been successful.
Do you have personal relationships in that sort of vein?
Cuban Americans who disagree with me 110%. And I point out things like, well, look, I understand your issues with the Cuban government. They do jail opposition. Also, a top-down economy doesn't give the Cuban people the opportunity to use their innovation, to invest, all sorts of things. It's not a great government. But let's face it, U.S. policy has failed. We keep trying to do the same thing again and again and again. And I guess that's, you have to decide at some point, look, it doesn't work. And then they might say, well, Obama tried it and people didn't get out of jail. But human rights have improved in Cuba, and they began improving during Obama. And also, we got more entrepreneurs in Cuba during that time, and more openness to entrepreneurs, as I already mentioned. So I think you can show that a different kind of policy will begin to change things. Certainly not overnight, because we're talking about a government, a single party government that's been in control for 60 years. So it isn't just going to be, we've solved the expropriation problems, we've solved the embargo issues, now it's open for investment. No, we're talking about a long-term peaceful change. And it will come about sooner and quicker with this kind of engagement.
Mhm.
Another argument I like to use is look what's happening now. So you have
Exactly.
this tough policy of the Trump administration. So what's happening with Russia? Russia is moving back into Cuba in big ways. They're providing Cuba with subsidized oil, a couple of tankers full, and they're reopening their military base at San Antonio de los Baños, which is the best place in the world to intercept satellite communications because Cuba sits in the widest part of the world, and therefore you have more satellites going over this area. So it's just crazy that we're pushing Cuba into the arms of the Russians, also of the Chinese, because the Chinese are now Cuba's largest trading partner. They provide all their buses, transportation. Uh, it's crazy. We're 90 miles off their coast. We should be Cuba's largest trading partner. So, what our policy does by being the enemy, by not trading, is it pushes Cuba into the arms of countries we are competitors or enemies with. Uh, I think one of the biggest missed opportunities under the Trump administration was that if they had continued the Obama opening to Cuba, I think Raul Castro and then Diaz-Canel, the current president, would have been very helpful on Venezuela. And we have a real mess on Venezuela right now.
Yeah, I'm half Venezuelan, half Cuban. So I understand.
Yeah. And you know, now the policy, having failed so much, looks to other people like it's just punishment.
Mhm.
And the final argument, and I use it in the end of my book, Our Woman in Havana, is that Cuba isn't going to negotiate for the expropriated property and and, and purchases from the United States as long as we have a hostile relationship. It's much more likely Cubans will get back their property or be compensated for it if we have a better relationship. I talk about the fact that we have in the embassy all these treasure gold and silver and beautiful jewelry, pearls that Cubans turned over to the Swiss when they were in our embassy before departing. It would be so easy to give that jewelry and those keepsakes back to Cuban Americans if we had a good relationship.
That seems like I think the last one, considering where I grew up in Miami, a very powerful argument. Sort of sentimental, evidentiary, sort of physical way of healing some of that. So that's great. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It just reminds me to say one more thing. A Cuban American once said to me, I don't really want all the jewelry that's there. I know it's there, but I'd like to have the 5 golden rings. We're a family tradition. I'd like to hand them down to my son.
It's good.
To just look at him.
It's great.
That is great. Let's do one more question before we wrap up this afternoon.
So I was wondering if you knew anything or could tell us anything about the current person who succeeded Raul as the president, Manuel Diaz-Canel, and how, even though Raul holds the military top position, party top position, how you see this playing out, and if you know anything about Miguel and how he might lead the country.
I know little about him because actually I haven't been back to Cuba since he took the presidency. I think it's all to the good to have a non-Castro after over 50 years as president of Cuba, someone born after the revolution. Obviously, he wouldn't be in the presidency if he weren't a loyal, trusted cadre. But he's the man who understands technology, who obviously has opened up Cuba on the travel and the communication side. although it's disappointing to see him rolling back the private business side, particularly the greater constraints on artists in Cuba. I assume he has to keep the hard line, the old guard, the revolutionaries happy, and these are things that he does to do that. I think he's made a good impression in general on the world stage, handled himself well at the United Nations. I think he's a man the United States could work with, and it's too bad we're not working with him.
Thank you, Ambassador Huddleston, for your time and for your insight, for your rallying cries. And thank you to the members of the Unidas delegation for participating this afternoon as well. Nos vemos en La Habana. And I am really grateful again to you, Ambassador Huddleston, for your words of wisdom. And everybody have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon.
Well, good luck to all of us in 2019, and may we see a great improvement in relations. And good luck, all of you, on your visit to Cuba. You really will make a difference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.